Hey all, I thought I would go ahead and go through some examples of instrumentation for my own dissertation process that might be a good help for you to understand some of the concepts in the textbook and in the lectures. So my doctoral dissertation was Staying the Course, Grit, Academic Success, and Non-Traditional Doctoral Students. And the introduction basically is the study was about understanding what makes some online doctoral students more successful than others, and I'm positing mine was a quantitative study, so I was hypothesizing that a specific character trait called grit, which is passion and persistence for long-term goals, might impact non-traditional doctoral student success. So of course I give some background, and then I have the statement of the purpose. The purpose of this study was to understand A, the differences between mean grit scores of first, second, and third year doctoral students. B, if there's a relationship between student grit scores and current programmatic GPA. And C, to examine any differences, if at all, between mean third year student grit scores of those who have or have not successfully defended their dissertation proposal. So I'm looking at a grit score that's calculated from a survey instrument previously normed and validated and shown to be reliable by Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania to measure grit, which is the passion and persistence for long-term goals. And now I'm looking at how does grit possibly influence doctoral student persistence and actual accomplishment, academic success. So here is a table that may be useful for you in understanding one of the concepts we're talking about this week, and that is variables. This is a quantitative dissertation, and so quantitative dissertations conceptualize different parts of it as variables. You have your independent variables over here on the left-hand side, and your dependent variables on the right-hand side, or rather my right-hand side. And in the middle, something called controlling variables I'll talk about in a minute. The way to remember independent and dependent is that independent variables influence dependent. I for influence, so independent influence dependent variables. So in this case, I'm saying mean or average student grit scores for first year, second year, and third year students influence the number of courses successfully completed by those students in those groups. In other words, what I'm saying is that the mean grit scores should be different for first year students, second year students, and third year students. Here's another one. Student grit scores in general might influence a student's GPA or grade point average. Over here, one more. The mean or average student grit scores of third year students only might influence successful completion or non-completion of a proposal defense. So these independent variables are influencing or might influence, because I'm making hypotheses about whether or not they might influence one another. So independent influences dependent. The controlling variables are those things that are in the middle that I need to take into account for, such as student characteristics, because maybe perhaps it's not grit that's influencing, perhaps really it's just that certain demographics or a certain kind of student might exhibit these differences in these groups. Same thing over here with the student grit scores along here. So I need to take into consideration those controlling or mitigating variables. I'm not going to show you the video. Here's a definition of grit from the research. Persistence and passion for long-term goals. So the gritty individual approaches achievement as a marathon, his or her advantage is stamina. Thus, grit is a non-cognitive measure. So it's about not just being able to go after a goal for a long time, but it's also about focusing in on a certain goal for over a long time. A gritty person might be able to really go after something like a long-term dissertation process or doctoral journey, and that's why I'm using this construct for this. You might think of someone who doesn't have grit, for example, someone who may be able to stick to their diet and has a lot of self-control but changes careers every year. They wouldn't be gritty, they'd be persistent, but they wouldn't have that second component of a focused passion on a goal. So my methodology was quantitative. It was a between groups or a causal comparative design, as it talks about in your lectures or in your textbook. And I also had a correlational aspect to this study. So here's the between groups design. I was looking at the mean grit score, so the average grit scores of all first-year students, first-year online doctoral students. So I looked at their average grit scores in comparison to the average grit scores for second-year students and third-year students. My hypothesis being that those students that had made it further into the program, third-year students, would have an average higher grit score. The logic being that weaker students would have fallen out in the first and second years, and then in the third year we would have had a higher mean grit score because the grittier students made it through. Down here I describe what kinds of statistical tests I will need to run to analyze and compare these means, this comparison of means. If I had two groups, just these two, I would be using a t-test. Because I'm using 3 or more groups, I'm using an ANOVA, and an ANCOVA is which controls for those covariates or those mitigating variables we talked about, demographics. And then there's also some post hoc or after the fact tests that we ran called Tukey, but I won't get into those. The correlational aspect is examining whether or not there's a relationship between grit scores, student grit scores, and their GPA, and my hypothesis being that those that had higher grit scores would also have higher GPAs. And for that analysis, we used a Pearson correlation and a multiple regression in order to control for variables. The last design feature for answering my research questions was another between groups or causal comparative, where I looked only at third-year students and said, I want to split them into two groups. Those third-year students that have defended their proposal successfully and those who have not yet defended their proposal successfully. And so these are the two groups here that I'm actually looking at the average score, grit score of those who have defended and the average grit score of those who have not, and I compared those together with a t-test, when you can also use an ANOVA, because an ANOVA is just a repeated measure of t-test, and an ANCOVA to control for those covariates. So here goes the sampling and data collection. The population was 3,200 non-traditional doctoral students online with limited residency at a private university in the Southwest. An online survey sent to email and posted on the intranet. And 730 students completed the survey, but after I sorted out, had to throw out a couple of those because they put 0 for their age, etc. I ended up, after cleaning the data, only having 669 completed surveys to use and analyze. This number, there's 669, that is the actual sample that I had, is big enough to generalize to the 3,200, and there's actually tables for these if you look them up that will tell you how many people do I need to answer my survey, or how much data do I need to collect in order to generalize to a certain population. So I can only generalize to this 3,200, so not to all non-traditional doctoral students, but only to the 3,200 within that program that I was studying. Here's some charts of how it looks in the SPSS once you do it. This is an ANOVA, etc. But what I really wanted you guys to understand was the variables, the sampling, and how kind of you have to really, really hone in on what exactly you want to study and get very specific. So I hope this helps.